Okay. Hi, everyone. I welcome you all to this installment of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers who write on animals and human-animal relations. We're the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan Haris. My co-host Anu Pande from EFLU is also here. The Indian Animal Studies Collective aims to bring together academics and writers who are working on animals in India. Today, we are here to discuss Prasanta Chakravarty's recent book, The Creature in Power and Pain. Prashanto is a professor at BU, and it's so great to see him here after so many years. I thought we could begin the discussion by talking about the creature himself, or the creature itself, and how you situate the creature in the two categories that run through the book, power and pain. And for the purposes of our group, it would be so great if you could tell us how you define the creature itself. Is it a pan-species thing, or is it human herself?
Right. No, I think in the sort of pamphlet or the poster that you sent, you really succinctly summed up in one line what I wanted to say in this whole book. So what you said in that poster is somewhat akin to what I think about pain and force, or pain and power, is a kind of constitutive condition of living. I think that is the very baseline sort of hypothesis, if you like, for the book in different ways. And then I was interested to see the whole idea of a kind of a relationship between the very idea of force and pain sort of coupling together and getting into this moment of reflux, if you like, like what happens in your head if you are hunted, or if you want to hunt others. A very basic question. Now, it's a very Spartan kind of a exactitude, if you like, a kind of an agonal spirit of the force, where now this relationship between the hunter and the hunted, sort of a reflex, which I thought was very important to get into this whole idea of the coupling, and then and then this is not just a individual thing. It's of course there's a collective aspect to it, which is where my first chapter begins with the imitative hive of the creatures, where I particularly discuss a very interesting science fiction work by the sociologist Gabriel Tarde, Underground Man, where you have the social segmentation of a kind, and then the whole question of terror and myth comes in, very esoteric kind of possibilities. In a way, I'm also looking at, I think, the coupling that we are suggesting. We are also interested to look at the whole process of dehumanization. Now, when dehumanization, I'm using this word not as an evaluative or a sort of pejorative category, but this whole idea of being swept up, if you like, being swept up during times of tumult, during moments of reflux, where, say, a civil war like condition, where human beings sort of become automatons. They are like pastoral flock, and they behave with what one calls politely a kind of collegial sociability. Now, and they begin to perform certain motions, and that brings a certain kind of force into other fellow beings, all being creatures, and that spiraling kind of downward force is what my last chapter is about Simone Weil. She calls it gravity. Now, this force is something which is the pitilessness of the force. That shrouds the perpetrator and the sufferer alike. I think this is the coupling that I was interested in. To the perpetrator, it's a it's a force, is a kind of an intoxicating weapon. To the victim, it's a crushing sort of blind machine. But neither really possesses it truly. It's a sort of elusive. Like Will talks about Iliad, and she says, that somebody was here, and the next minute there is nobody at all during war. I mean, this sense, I mean, which in a time of uh, acceleration, we have that, this, and she talks about it without the spectacle, very absolutely undiluted. There is no consoling prospect of immortality or patriotism on the hero. It just vanishes. So, I was really trying to look at the idea of calamity, but calamity in a way where, accidents are incidents in the way they happen as they would, with the contingent joy and terror and this, the, the our attachment, immediate attachment with other creatures immediately means that we have started the process of abandonment. This, without abandonment, there is no attachment. So therefore, the creation of destitution. This destitution is a kind of primal vulnerability, which I think the initial question that you asked, that between force and pain, sort of, this brings us to this, what one can call this vital, vital, vital forces, prison house of vital forces. There's a very, very interesting, very well-known philosophical sort of a, image by Spinoza about an ass, Buridan's ass. An ass placed as an equal distance between two bales of hay will die of hunger, but it will not turn towards one or the other unless an external force intervenes. And that is what happens in a time like, when times become hurried and accelerated, and people do not know, and creatures do not know what to do. They will turn like this, paralyzed ass. And there'll be sudden clarity, sudden darkness, some kind of spiritual agoraphobia, one can say. So that was all these things. Yeah, please go ahead.
I remember reading about it, and yeah, Simone Weil's, you keep using her beautifully throughout the book, and at some point you talk about her point about decreation, and at some point you talk about how it's another kind of humanism for animals, for when we talk about bringing animals back, using rights into the community. So I'm just thinking, then this kind of Spartan exactitude of pain and power, is that a kind of ontological given for every creature? And if that is an ontological given, would that mean adopting a kind of quietist attitude towards life? Is there no way to escape from these shackles, so to speak?
No, I think that's a very, very valid question and important question, and much of the book actually tries to address that. One thing I should also say that what it does not try to do, and that dovetails with what you're asking me. I think what I wanted to steer clear of is what the theater critic Howard Barker calls miserablism. Miserablism is a kind of baleful invocation of conscience, or lamentation for past things that have gone, etc. Now that leads to that can lead to sensitivity, privacy, self-intimation, but not the kind of destitution, vulnerability that we're talking about. So, or it is not about the return of the repressed, let us say, which is another way of looking into it, or neither about fate as such. It's not not about stoicism or therapy of that, but these are the things that I wanted to steer clear of about when I was trying to talk about this coupling. Now, what you're coming back to your question, one is at one level I talk about literature. I'll come to that later if you allow me, but now I think I'll jump guns a little bit and go to the third level, which I think in quite a few essays, one on by Timothy Fiva on the on animals, and some other books, and on Jibanananda's writings also in that essay. I look at pain as also eccentric and the idiotic. I think is very central to understanding what pain might be. And if one gets it, understands this side, one can see that many of the authors and artists that I was trying to talk about and discuss has an immense sense of generosity and largesse. Uh, this is a kind of there's a kind of neutral and residual sorrow which might lead to immobilization, but also lead to a certain kind of visitation. Like tragedy is also about deep visitation of something. It's a fortunate misfortune, if you like, which clears path for certain possibilities. It grounds, takes us to certain mutations. It generates fortitude, for example. It there's a long discussion on the Russian writer Platonov in the book about this condition that is in Russian is known as Tosca. And Tosca is a kind of condition of unbearable pressure. This unbearable pressure, which is about this coupling between pain and force, this also makes people that makes people tormented and longing for things. There's a kind of torn heart beating within extreme discord, but also it leads to something what certain authors that I've been dealing with calls poor life. Now this poor life is about a certain once one is passing through this purgatorial sort of idiocy, if you like, there's a possibility that the creature will become diligent, childlike, open-ended, non-judgmental. I mean, I can think of someone who I have not dealt with in the book, who has said in much profound way and poetic way and artistic way, William Blake, that the whole question of diligence is about a certain kind of perdurance. You don't endure anymore; you begin to perdure, right? So and that means you see a flicker of creaturely equity in existence, right? And that could make that would take us away from the miserablism that I was talking about, the idea of the bourgeois idea of trauma and so on. So you move away. Generous creatures are giving creatures, and this givingness is not sacrifice, but but it comes out of this unbearable pressure, Tosca, right? The poverty that we're talking about. I'll just read one if you allow me, half a minute. I'll read one section from Platonov's short story called "The Cow," and see how he talks about this givingness, generosity of the creature. He puts it like this: "We had a cow. While she lived, my mother, my father, and I all ate milk from her. Then she had a son, a calf, and he drank from her too. There were three of us, and he made four, and there was enough milk for all of us. The cow also plowed and carried loads. Then her son was sold for meat. He was killed and eaten. The cow was very unhappy, but she soon died from a train. And then she was eaten too, because she was beef. Now there is nothing. The cow gave us everything. That is her milk, her son, her meat, her skin, her innards, and her bones. She was kind." Now, I think this givingness sort of marks a kind of, something which comes out of the condition, the horrifying condition and neutral condition of coupling between pain and force, I think. If you like, you can call it grace, but I'm I'll refrain from using a overtly religious term, but not because I'm afraid to get into religion, which is very important, I think, to go into the aspects that I go to go into. Lev Shestov and Dostoevsky means to get into a very powerful idea of givingness. So there is, going back to your question, is that there is an elsewhere. There's one chapter on by Aniket Javre,
Yes.
Javre's work, who talks about destitution leading to elsewhere possibilities. So that is one aspect of it, and the other is literature, about which I can come later.
Anu, go ahead. And just one more thing, I forgot to add this in the beginning because there's lots of new faces here. This is a very informal conversation. Please feel free to ask a question at any point. Just unmute yourself or raise a hand or put your question in the chat box. It's just for an hour, so time's going to fly by quickly. Anu, please ask.
Thank you, Susan. So Prashanta, my first question is pertaining to the term destitution that you mentioned a little while ago, and a destitution as a kind of primal vulnerability, if I remember correctly. And I was wondering, because it reminds me kind of Derrida and the moment of vulnerability in the famous scene of the naked philosopher and his cat looking at each other. And I wondered if you see it also in the same way.
Yeah, I mean that is a great example. I agree. I mean Derrida has always, later Derrida especially, has looked into these questions very, as all of us know. Many of his works have come to this question: gift, hospitality, restitution. All of this has a kind of tapestry that he builds up. So certainly, but I'm not a Derridian to go into the details, but the impulse, I think, what you're talking about, of destitution is, which I see in the works that I have dealt with, or the works that I like, to read and watch and see, is this question of a kind of what one says, the kind of idle stroke of luck, or idle stroke of the hammer of force, which creates this vulnerability all the time. This is creating, and we begin to skirt the issue. We begin to camouflage those and keep the ego in front, and so that we think that we'll somehow manage. Now, it's not a matter of managing. That is the whole problem. I mean, if you're not, it's about certain kind of confrontation, with what one can call weighty destiny, or a certain kind of even joy and wonder, which I think is one central strand in the book. It's although I talk about pain and force, but there is a lot of, if you pass through that purgatory, there is possibility of various kinds of sort of revelation, if you like, right? So that, I think, would be my immediate answer to you.
I had a question related to what Anu is asking, which is about compassion, because Derrida talks about this looking at the animal and seeing the animal suffering and the pathos that we can see in images, and that causing, that generating compassion and being the basis of laws and so on. Whereas, in your book, you take a stand against compassion, and even when you discuss tragedy, you show how Krishli arrives at this. At least he notices that compassion is, you don't arrive at compassion in some linear way, and even if we're in a democratic society, if we don't arrive at it in a linear way, that can be problematic. And so I want to know what you think about compassion. And my second question is more broadly related to what I thought was interesting about your book, is that it doesn't seem to be about phenomenology. It seems to actively work against a kind of phenomenology of description of different ways to talk about pain, such as suffering or compassion as a response to suffering.
No, I think there are several things, much more intuitively written book, so I can't really pinpoint and say, I'm following this or that. It's like coming together of various strands, whatever I have read in different ways. So there's a baggy quality to the book, I think, but you're absolutely right. I as I said, if grace or compassion comes, I just keep it at bay as much as possible. It may or may not, we cannot quickly go there. There is a whole process through which creatures have to pass, and that needs patience and diligence and sort of get into that first, and that takes much of the book, before going into that. So so it's an inverted way of, if we are fragmented puppets, if we are grotesque fools, if that is the kind of thing that we start with, then there are certain possibilities. We can be, again, going back to your earlier question, the other answer could be, one could be skeptical, one could see that life is full of riddles, that, everything is crystal clear and therefore never explained, that is the kind of conundrum. So form is given to a kind of destiny. The other, we talked about grace, already, that there is a kind of, something beyond moral ideals, or refuge in rituals only, or nature, let us say, but a kind of a domain of translucence, which is looking through a glass darkly, which is what Bergman or Chekhov or others have dealt in such a masterly way, seeking colors within silence, I would say. And there is a kind of miraculous metamorphosis in that route. The other thing which is my bread and butter is poetry, right, or art, where the question of myths and oracles and little riddles, it takes much of the book, where even before going to compassion or the ethical questions that one asks about the creaturely condition, looking at the aesthetic part of it. And Jibanananda Das, I think, says very succinctly that a poet is, there's a poetry or art is about what he calls karu nirdesh. It is about a kind of edict. A literary work or a dance performance or in potter's art is a kind of an edict. Poets sort of visit illegitimate roads, ask illegitimate questions. There's a kind of singular ache, and he's like a like an insect who creates the tapestry. Eat nirmata, he says. And the poet is also tribhuvanchari. He can travel different celestial zones and so on. Of course, that means it's drifting. This idea of drifting and rootlessness, I think, is pervasive in the book, in the literary aspects also, but also in the some political. There's a chapter on Machiavelli, on the populist question, and there's also a couple of political chapters where I was trying to look at the same question in different ways. What does it mean to be, dense and turgid times? What does it mean politically to pass through such a time, and not camouflage and skirt things, confront things rather? That was the kind of possibility. So compassion, so many wonderful people have written so much, very nuanced stuff in so many ways. I like, for example, Gillian Rose's work, or Derrida you have mentioned, and many others. But it can wait, so it can come at an inverted fashion at some point. And there are scope, in Simone Weil's chapter, I think it comes through what she calls attention and concentration. She says attention means like a school student doing geometry. For a school student, it does not matter whether she actually cracks the puzzle of the geometric question. It means that she has to solve this homework. She's absolutely concentrated. This is important for the creaturely condition. Not quickly sort of judge or comment or give opinions. Maybe.
I have a question about this, but we will take some questions. Questions are coming in. I saw that Divyaraj had raised his hand before. Would you like to ask your question? I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but if you have a question, go ahead.
The question is still unripe. I will take my time. Thank you.
Okay.
I had a question or a remark, or I can just, I will just make this remark. Thank you very much, Prashant. We are seeing each other after a long time. Perhaps you remember me.
Yes,
so
yes,
it's great that I got the invitation yesterday. And I'm here also with my friends. Vinay is also here.
Hello,
and
Vinay.
Right now, so it's great that we are discussing right now the same topic in a way. And the point that was made by Vinay in our discussions was very interesting to me, that I wanted to share with you and want to know about your idea. I mean, because I haven't read your book. I'm sorry about that. Definitely we'll look into it. that he made a point that the misery, I mean, it can be there in social life, also to say in human life, but we have to make a difference between the social life, which is socialized, that you have this, you can have this wildness, you can have this misery, you can have this pain, you can have this torture, all that we are trying to explain. But something is unique to civilization, to domestication, because it turns your being against the being itself. I mean, the very anti-being becomes the precondition of our being. I mean, you can have this misery in the nature or whatever the way you want to describe it. The basic difference between the wildlife and the civilization and domestication, there is a line that we need to draw. There is no sustained effort to control and manipulate. I mean, the wild animals can kill each other. They will mate with each other. They will, whatever, but this kind of attempt to systematically turn the life, the products of our life and labor against our existence itself. The more you exist, the more it turns against you. The more you work, the more it turns against them. So if we want to make a distinction, I mean, I'm trying to insist upon that we shouldn't blur the difference between the misery in the nature and the misery in the civilization. There's a huge difference. Otherwise, it might slip into the direction of, perhaps you all are aware of this trivial fact that we might go in the direction of, how to say, that we can justify the crimes of the handful of criminals who have monopolized the control over nature, or the majority of the mankind, and also definitely they have normalized the food chain within the wildlife, which is normal, and now it has been turned normalized in the civilization. I mean, that we are called human resources. I mean, in our face, that we are, I mean, departments are called human resource development departments in the corporates, in the ministry for human. So somebody can call us that we are their resource in our face. This kind of audacity that they can have. I mean, they can turn it. So I think, is it true that, I mean, this kind of distinction is there or not? That this kind of between the wildlife and the civilization. I mean, the animal tries to run away from the lion. And in our civilization, what happens is the animals try to leap into the mouth of the lion, give me a job, give me career, domesticate me. So that's the basic difference between wildlife and civilization. In wildlife, you run away from your hunter. In civilization, you jostle among yourselves. You fight against each other to get into the mouth of the lion. That if you don't domesticate me, if you don't give me a job, you don't give me career, you don't give me employment, then we are left out. So that's all, you know, that I want. Perhaps, I mean, definitely it's, thanks, Susan, that the whole thing is very informal. So perhaps we can discuss it in detail now. So that was all I wanted to ask.
Thank you. Susan, do you want me to respond to this?
If you like.
Yeah, just 1 or 2 words. You know, I mean, the caveat is very well taken, I think, and that's obvious caveat that, you know, one would raise with the kind of immersion into creaturely life, you know, I think. But what I was trying to say, you know, is that there's nothing on the cheap. That is to say, you know, you pass through certain things rather than bracketing off, and particularly the life's variegated sort of possibilities, you know, is something that is often being bracketed off within the civilized in a way, which is not to make this sharp distinction between the, I mean, that doesn't make sense, polarized distinction between what is civilized and what is not, what is intellect and what is feeling, etc., etc. I don't think that works. But in a way to get into, as a student of literature and life, I think, you know, it's very important to see the power of the, say, any big writer or someone who is observant of life. You know, if you're a classicist, you know, if you are a romantic, if you're a modernist, you'll get into the complexities of living in various ways, you know. Even complicated humanists will do that, I think, you know, which we're dealing with. But there is a tendency of this, you know, quickly getting into bracket. It's not possible right now, you know, what you're saying, you know, precisely for the reasons that you're saying, in various ways too. Things have come out, you know, the genie is out of the box, so to say, and we have to confront that. in various ways. That reckoning has to be done. Very powerful, either this way or that.
We'll take a few questions from the chat. Krishnanuni
Thank you.
asks, Robert Calasso in The Celestial Hunter has a chapter where he discusses the relationship between the hunter and the hunted. And he discusses this in the context of pain, suffering, and fear, and later in the context of a phenomenological discourse. The creaturely life is to some extent an inverted way of looking at life, according to Calasso. So how would you respond to that? Is the creaturely life an inverted way of looking at the ethical encounter?
Well, I mean, I have not read this particular book that you're talking about, but that your question, I'm getting sense of that. Now the inversion that we're talking about between the hunter and the hunted sometimes happens. The erstwhile hunter says that at some point when the hunted sort of becomes the hunter, why are you doing so? So now the erstwhile hunted, who has now become the hunter, says, sometimes poor people also get bored, right? This boredom, I think this ennui, this casual cruelty is something that is very central to my book. This idea of casually random, idea of force, which is I don't want to call it fate. I don't want to give or a stoic expression to it. It happens because it happens in a way. This is not to justify this. It's not about justification or not. If it happens all the time. We are doing that in a way. This is a dehumanization part of it. How should we confront it without bracketing it off? So that's a roundabout response to your question.
And I have a question related to that, which is this, there's one way to think about it as an encounter, and then there's the way to think about it like Simone Weil thinks about it through attention. And it seems to me that and this is just, I'm just thinking it through, and I think sometimes when we talk about animals, for example, there's so much emphasis on the ethical encounter and the person responding to something that they've witnessed or something that they see, and that can cause compassion, etc. Whereas maybe what you're suggesting could be that if there is some kind of creaturely equity, then it isn't on the self to respond to the other. It is on this kind of attention to what is happening around you that needs to be more than an encounter. Would that be? Would that?
Yes, I think you have summed up very well. I couldn't have done a better job. You have exactly said what I was thinking. In many parts of the book, that this is a kind of naivety, if I may use the word, and I go back to William Blake, he started from innocence, experience, and there's a higher kind of innocence, but that higher kind of innocence, there's a price to pay for that, that price has to be first extracted, and that price is very important. We all have to pass through that, purgatory in a way to get into that. We don't know whether we'll get there or not, that's an open-ended question. As I'm repeating, we cannot foresee grace. But we can at least be attentive, as you're saying, or concentrated, like the child who sort of goes for the milk or a ball, intuitively, that this is something I like, and she cries for the ball or the milk. This is what is something very, very interesting, and takes us to the other side of the creaturely coupling. That is one way to sort of confront force, I think, and wait, take time. And be diligent, which I'm going back to the word, which can lead to the givingness of the cow that I was just reading from that text. Right.
Professor Rukmini, do you want to ask your questions?
Hi. So I just had a couple of minor points, really. The point to which this conversation, and conversations are also a series of digressions, this conversation has kept coming back to this notion of attention, which you have in Simone Weil. Now, in English, and also as tropes, to attend is part of a series of words like intend, contend, and so on. Attend is part of contend, intent, and so on, which all means directing attention away from, not towards. And that is why you have notions like vakrukti, turning away from in Sanskrit, and the word trope itself, which means twisting or turning away from things. So attention, to what extent is it about actually turning attention away from a path rather than being sort of following a path? And that is a sort of basic, people like me who are interested in how words reflect circumstance, are interested in why it is that attention keeps turning away, and you get this in the analysis of tropes as well. So I'd like to understand better your notion of attention, or Simone Weil's notion of attention and its relation to pain. That's one sort of question. The other sort of question I had was this notion of a perpetual giving and a perpetual vulnerability. How is it related to the notion, Wittgenstein's notion, that pain is inalienable? You cannot say to people, give me your pain. It's an inalienable, ungenerous text, the text of pain. So how do you relate the inalienability of pain to the notion of the givingness of pain? And thirdly, pain is among qualia sensations like seeing red or hearing thunder. You immediately have the sensation, but it is almost impossible to convey it in language. So how is it that you think literature is the solution to the notion of pain?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Barnett. I think I'll try to club the first and the third point and then go to the second point. Because first and the third has a connection with the literary, the question of tropes that you also posit. I think how can one convert? In the, I was thinking, and I wrote a long section in this book and was read for a while Giambattista Vico's ideas on the question of the feral, creature traveling around the world, and then from there you gradually move into the myths, and then from there you go into the poetic possibilities. He has a particular linearity into the model, but if we leave aside that, the question of converting the, one can be converting the mythical anthropological into a poetic utterance through many myths, heroic, myths, for example, of science of schemata, one can say, where we see the ambiguous turning into this notion of the opacity of tragedy, and then, the certain ways by which that can be worked out. The other is the lyrical. I think the lyrical is very, very important, which has not been, now it has come back in a big way. I think the idea of form and lyric, the idea of the rhythm and the sublime, where there is astonishment and wonder. And there's two chapters I wrote on song and another on opera, where I looked at what one calls the aromatic and the sonorous enthrallment of the seduction and death, which is part of opera particularly, and the idea of song itself, which is liberating, but where we see the idea of force and pain, and which has been converted into the lyrical, into a certain kind of trope, whereby we see traces flicker and sort of disappear into eternity. So the question of converting the sensuous or the mythopoeic into literature is one is going away from takes us away from attention. You're right, much of it. But I think, as I said, It could be a classist, it could be a romantic, it could be modernist, in various serious engagements with these questions, the major movements in West, also in India. I was just reading, certain text by the Buddhist philosopher Vasubandhu. He talks about the idea of ghosts, etc., in the enchanted world. But I'm sort of digressing. Coming back to the question, is that this question of conversion and moving it towards attention is a very difficult thing, I think, and I agree with you. It is not easy to. It's usually will move out of that. So there's some complexity converted into the naive in a way, and therefore I was going back to William Blake. In many ways, I think is a very powerful example, and there could be many others, whereby we see this conversion happening through creation of certain kind of symbols which are not inattentive, which are absolutely concentrated, and concentrated to the idea of concentrated will. I think is also important here in a way by which that transference can happen. If that happens, then we are into a zone of incandescence. We are into a zone of the divine, if you like, where we understand that force and pain can take us to that kind of literature. That's going back to your question. The second question about how, if I got that question correctly, inalienable pain. Is that what you said? How can that become? Yeah, how can that be?
Inalienable in one sense. You can't transfer it easily. So that's an ontological problem.
Right. Yeah, I remember. Yeah. No, in the very first section I was trying to say, as Susan is trying to tell all of us that, in various ways trying to push pain into this zone of neutrality, away from, hurt or suffering or as I said, bourgeois idea of trauma, etc., which is a kind of industry now. But this whole thing about, can lead to what one calls pain asymbolism, that you get into neutrality of pain and then you become painless. Now that I think you cross a line, and then you suggest that, your excessive pain makes us painless, and therefore we should keep away from that. Now, that's a very tricky zone. I'm trying to push pain to an extent whereby I'm trying to move away from the personal and trying to keep away all this, pathos, the pathetic, let us say, away from the whole question of force and pain, and yet not become, neutral in the sense that, Junger has a book on neutrality, and we know he has a particular fascist ideas of pain, So that I think is a very thin line to cross over and make pain kind of neutral and justify violence in a way which becomes a part of our existence. I think literature and art can do that conversion. If ethics, Simone Weil could do it in her own way. It depends how you do it. But, yeah. And that's a provisional answer. If I don't know whether I got your questions correctly.
Are you saying that literature can do something which language cannot? Because language is, unable to capture pain, but literature, you say, can do it. And that brings me to the question of the animal. So what would be a kind of parallel in the universe of the animal? Because the answer you're giving is interesting and difficult. You're saying, as a linguist, I would say, you can't really get this stuff out in language, just as you can't describe the color red. You can see it, but you can't get it out into language. It's almost impossible. So, but you're saying literature can do it. Language cannot, but literature can. And that's a kind of interesting, I'd like to understand it better.
Yeah, I think yes and no. I mean, I'm not making this very stark distinction that you're making. I'm suggesting that, there are other forms of language, if you like. Certainly communicative language is not going to help here, but there are other, it starts with gesture, let us say. When I'm talking about lyric, I'm thinking about, blabbering. Someone in the throes of love or in front of your God, you begin to blabber. And blabbering, whether you call it language or gesture, I don't know. You can give a much better answer to that. Or, doodle. I mean, doodling is pre-linguistic in a way, but doodling is something very important by which we are getting into language, but we are somewhere in the cusp between our raw expressions and formulating those expressions, I think,
Thank
So
you.
I'm thinking in those terms. Yeah.
To stick with this question of attention, attention or attentiveness, I'm also wondering, because in a lot of great poetry, especially since you discuss Rilke and Hughes's poetry on the panther and so on, I'm also wondering if this attentiveness works by transforming, or if it works by conversion. So I'm thinking maybe, in communicative language, perhaps you have to convert the animal into something else, or convert the animal into something that can be deserving of compassion for you to be passionate to that animal. Whereas perhaps in poetry, since attentiveness happens through lines, and since it's a process, maybe the emphasis is not on conversion, which again would bring us back to an ethical encounter, but instead on a transformation that the poet takes us through. Would you think that works?
Yes, I think that takes me gives me opportunity to talk about the other strand that in the book you mentioned, Thaddeus, Grace Lawrence also worked on this, and many others, in the way where there's one chapter on Ernst Bloch, and then where I look at Ernst Bloch and Timmy Puffer, both are Marxists, as you know, but Marxists of a particular kind. Ernst Bloch is an Aristotelian left thinker who thinks there's a latency and tendency in matter. This latency and tendency in matter means there's a which is not about atomistic idea of matter, but that matter can be transfigured, the form can be transfigured into some kind of a block. It's a kind of revolutionary gnosis that he calls, Therefore, he's interested in music, he's interested in detective fiction, he's interested in fairy tale, what he calls colportage. These are very connects expressionism and Marxism very curiously, which usually doesn't go together. But there are possibilities. There's one chapter on Sarah Kane, the British playwright. The whole chapter, that's one of my favorite chapters in the book, where she gets into this whole question of, catastrophe. And what exactly catastrophe is, taking it very seriously without getting into a nihilistic sort of a, easy sort of exit, or a stoic sort of thing, but sort of confronting it. And then this, what you're saying, converting this transformation of matter in some sense, whereby we give expression to form in a certain way, and get into that poor life, more deeply, richly, is something that that is very central to certain literary approaches that I try to deal with. Tragedy is certainly one of those, but particularly where certain Spinoza's left tendencies we see in certain authors, whereby matter can be converted into movement, and then from there can be emergence of a kind, if there is at all, if there is an elsewhere, from this stunning sort of or stunned possibility, there could be possibilities of enchantment in different ways. There are different possibilities. I could structure it, I could give it shape into 3 or 4 structural ways, but you could do it in your own way. So everyone is free to do that in their own. But the basic idea is to confront it and pass through this moment of acute moment of coupling between force and pain, and then take things seriously, and romantically.
I'd just like to take Nandini's question, which they asked quite some time back, which is how can we situate pain? Would it be in this kind of final destitution moment or absence, or is it in the process itself? Is the existence or non-existence so sudden and now there's no process, which is important to us, because in a way animals live a life of pain in an exploitative world, But then for activists, for example, there's also the pain in the moment of an animal with a wound, for example. So in this, when we're thinking about creatureliness, is the pain the process of living itself?
Yes, yeah, I would say, this process of living, this is central. This idea of force and pain is happening all the time, and if we confront that, you talk about activism, I was talking about politics. Absolutely, activists of all kinds, and and I would say this could be one way of reaching out through the creaturely to our to the other. There's a kind of, I think, tendency in the book, and the way I think, at least, the kind of a different kind of pluralism, which we can happen only through contingency, by which we can reach to others who are not like us, and who we're not foreclosing that possibility. If we think that, we are fellow creatures in different ways, and all of us are vulnerable in different ways, uh, and we push the limits of our finitude and tolerance, if you like. But certainly, and it's a person for every person is particular, but it's also a much larger thing that's happening. Now, when I said this to one of my, very, very important, very, very powerful Hindi poet, who is my friend, Chetan Kranti, he said, sabka dukh itna bada nahi hota hai, Prashant. So he said, it's very, everyone's pain is not so large the way you are talking about. We have small pains, little pains. How about those? I think that's a very valid question. That uh, each of us have our stories to tell, and I think Whale is very, very attentive to that aspect, that we are not about, when we dehumanize, we also see what is the price to pay for that, etc. Each one of us. But it's a much larger structural thing that happens. And once we understand that, maybe we don't transcend pain. It's not about transcending, but confronting. I come back to that word.
And I'm thinking about poetry again, and this earlier discussion we had about attention. And it seems to me that, though I would like to qualify my earlier statement, which is that, even if a poem is being attentive towards someone or an animal as a process, it seems to me that at the end of the poem, it is still very much upon the other person to respond. So there is an ethical encounter there too. It's just that it's deferred or it's postponed, and it's up to the other person to see if they want to respond or not. And I'm thinking again about Simone Weil, and in her case, her life is a reflection of this Spartan exactitude, because she knows that God may not or cannot respond, and she's okay with that. So then, would you say that poetry is, or poetry that deals with non-human others or any kind of others, do you think poetry relies on that kind of ethical encounter, or is it not necessary? Because I remember reading Jivananda Das when I was an undergrad, and it's all about his suffering and agony, and I remember thinking that this is really painful, especially his poems on hunger and so on, but it's still just a response of sorts that must come up, right?
Yeah. And because you mentioned Jibanananda, and he's often thought as just an existential poet, which is not. It's much more involvement in the Walian sense, I think. If we read Thomas Mann and side by side Jibanananda, we get a sense of the greatness and power of Jibanananda's poetry, I think. Which often, there have been some great critiques of that, but people often skirt. They often read Jibanananda, Bengalis particularly, but they don't want to confront this darker side of him, and so on. It's a kind of figure of awe who has to be kept aside, etc. Now, that's a separate question. But coming to your point about ethicality, or the ethical, again, I'm sort of possibly repeating myself, but the point is that I think what I'm trying to say is leveling that's another word I can use, leveling with my interlocutor, with whoever I'm, sort of engaged in a conversation or attentive sort of a engagement, attentive sort of a relationship, relationality, whatever you call it, is something that already makes me ethical in a way that, that I'm getting into something which is deeper, and engagement by that person is understand, hopefully. I mean, I'm not saying creatures may not understand each other ever, but there's a larger, greater possibility of what you possibly are calling ethics, in a way by which we accept. Now, acceptance can also be suggested, as you said, is it quietude? Now, this is a question that I think at some point you started with. I think that's a very, again, a valid question. It could lead to quietude, but it may not also. Therefore, all the examples that I was giving about generosity, about literature, about givingness and so on, is not about quietude. It's about action. Simone Weil was all her life was an active life, in a most powerfully active life. How can that happen?
Yeah, that is true. That's a great point. Yeah, and she was always trying to make it happen in her life as well.
That's right.
And yeah, I just want you to speak a little bit about this plurality that you talk about in the book and the collective, because there's so much emphasis on the social as something that all creatures have access to. So then, for example, there's so much talk about multi-species justice, multi-species politics, and in that, I think it's about just because of it's a kind of environmentalism where all creatures, where the multiplicity is just about the number. But is that the same kind of multiplicity that you're talking about?
Now, what you're saying, Susan, you are much more aware, and you know about that literature, which I don't know about this. But I'm getting a drift of what you're trying to say. Hopefully, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the kind of, much more surface level multiplicity, pluralism of the kind that, all creatures are the same and so on, etc. If that is what you're trying to say, that we have to respect that. It may come from a, animals' rights point of view or some other point of view, I don't know, etc. No, I'm just talking about the verse of it. I think, I mean, in the whole book is a revolt against this particular approach of what you are calling pluralism. Pluralism is something someone can aim for, but it cannot come cheap. It has to be traversed through in a way by which we sort of confront and be attentive, and by that we get into that kind of pluralism. Otherwise, what happens, we actually break our creaturely, the other side, the casual cruelty side comes very soon, which is happening in many different ways, which we cannot get rid of. I'm not saying we can easily get rid of, but if we confront that, there is a possibility of a different kind of pluralism, I think, of understanding the vulnerability of that is each one of us, and as much as possible minimize the ego. That sounds like a cliche, but and I'm not giving a homily here. And the last thing that the book wants to is to give a homily. It's absolutely neutral sort of a statement that I'm giving here, in a way by which a certain kind of lucidity, if you like, can, and that lucidity will lead to could lead to a different kind of pluralism. I'm qualifying with could and should, because there is no, I'm not going to give an answer because there isn't any answer.
All right. I think that's an hour. Thanks a lot for being with us here. This was a great, exciting conversation. And thanks everyone for asking questions. For those questions we could not take, please consider joining us for future sessions. And you can see details about our future talks up on our website, indiananimalstudiescollective.com. And thanks again, Prasanta, for being here. The book is so exciting. It's introduced me to literature that I wasn't aware of, and it's helped me make connections that I hadn't thought of. Thanks again.
Believe me, I'm reading a lot of stuff, new stuff all the time, so it's your experience is also my experience. And thank you for I don't know, my gratitude to both of you, Anu and you and the whole collective and everyone who is part of this. It's absolutely thrilling to discuss this book, and it clarifies so many things for me further as I take this path. This whatever this streak, I think will be there in whatever I write in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.